let me just tell you the way monetary policy was made at the time. The way monetary policy was made at the time, the ultimate, the chairman of the Fed at the time, his name was William McChesney Martin. If you asked him how he made monetary policy, he says, "I simply, quote, lean against the wind." Now, what the hell does that mean? When the economy, in other words, do you lean at this point when the winds are blowing north? Do you lean at this point? Or, what point do you lean and how much? But anyway, to him it was an art. And only he knew how much to lean and when the winds were blowing in an appropriate way. So basically, monetary policy was made as an art, not a science. And it wasn't until later that it really is sort of becoming somewhat scientific, which, by the way, is a real, I think, danger. Because they now, what they do is they take the paradigm and they make it conform to equations, and if anything new happens, it's not going to be in those equations, which is exactly what happened in 2007. They were fighting inflation. August 3rd, 2007, the Fed puts out a statement, we're not going to do anything with the Fed fund rate because we're still in inflation fighting mode. And it took about 2 days till they saw the extent of the meltdown of the financial markets, and they changed their mind. And each one of these lines, each one of these vertical lines is a year, and this starts in 1790. And what you see in these dark areas are the misses of GDP from trend growth, and potential is trend growth. So basically, what you see here, going back to the beginning of the U.S. as a political entity, is the misses on the bottom and the misses on the top above the trend growth. And it's by year, and it took a lot of work to put this together because GDP numbers only go back to 1929, so someone had to do some very hard work to construct the numbers back to 1790. But what you see, and you take a look at this picture, boom, bust, boom, bust, boom, bust, boom, bust, boom, bust, all the way through. The biggest bust, and this is the Depression, just to give you some idea of the relative size of the Depression that people are talking about as compared to what we experienced beforehand. And this is the relative size of the World War II boom created by government spending and the war. Now, the Employment Act starts right here, 1946. And at this point forward, this is 1946. And now we start to have the Fed intervention to try to iron out the booms and the busts. And what you can see is, however they're doing monetary policy, whether they're leaning against the wind or they're doing it with Taylor rules or whatever, it doesn't matter. What you see is the size of the booms or the deviation from trend, the size of the booms and the size of the busts in the post-war period after they started to use the tools of monetary policy with an intent to take out the booms and the busts is very successful. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's sure way ahead of whatever we had before. So, in fact, what starts to happen is, I guess we had some deviations here. This ends in 86. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the same numbers in the same format, but on the next page, I guess 2, I have another graph which looks at really just the post-war period. 1948 is the first year on there. And this is not exactly the same. It's not the level of GDP relative to trend, but it's the changes. And so, in other words, in this situation, when the derivative is high and positive, you're growing fast. So, what we see, 1948 all the way up to 2007. So this is kind of the post-Employment Act era. And what you start to see are, plus 5%? When the economy is going up 5%, you usually use up your labor pretty quickly, and you start using your plan up quickly, and you start to get to inflation. So basically, if you're growing for more than a year or two, like here, well above 5%, like 12%, and this has to do with the post-World War II consumer boom of re-outfitting the firms. The consumers actually saved a lot of money during World War II, and they went out and spent it. So we had a boom, and then we had a few busts. This is 0% growth. We didn't have that many in that post-war period. 1 recession, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Not too many. And what you also notice is the size of the confines of the growth rate start to narrow over time. So obviously what you see is the Fed is learning. They're learning by doing, because they're taking out these high points and they're trying to get the economy to grow less than 5, which is pretty much, you can sustain 5% for a year or two without much inflation. But if you keep going past that, you generally run out of resources. So if you have an upper cap of 5% and you had a lower cap of 0, and what you see is a funnel, namely the percentage changes of the economy get narrower and narrower. This ends up having a name. It is called, quote, the Great Moderation. And the Great Moderation period that you hear referred to is 1984 to 2007. The name was given to the event by Bernanke. Not when he was chairman, but I guess he was on the board. And I think one of the last pages actually gives you the internet reference if you want to read the speech, or just simply go to Google and put in the Great Moderation if you want to read the Bernanke speech on it. I think it was in 2004 when he mentioned that. Is this it? Here we are. Bernanke's speech on the Great Moderation. Here it is. But anyway, could you go back to the previous one? So what we see is the federal, the old, what I'm calling the old paradigm worked. Namely, the Employment Act of 46, which tells the government to control the economy, control the excesses, worked beautifully. And as time goes on, it worked so well that we virtually didn't have recession and we virtually didn't have any unemployment. And on the face of it, it looks like we conquered the problem. We figured it all out. In Kuhn's terminology, we have this paradigm. It's hardwired. It goes into every textbook. Every student, undergraduate, learns it. And anyone in the profession has to know it, and how A affects B and B affects C, which affects C, then goes and affects D. Except one day, something happened. Out of left field, where no one was watching, a new variable, call it variable E, comes hurtling down on us. And they're not watching it, because they, at this point, got so totally, they declared victory, which meant that because people bought so much into the system, it's both the economists and Wall Street and Main Street and the bankers bought so much into the system, there was no risk. And if there's no risk, then you're free to, do exactly what companies did. They had less cash and had more debt, i.e. they levered themselves up and made themselves very vulnerable when variable E comes hurtling in from outer space. Now let me tell you about variable E. Variable E did come in and changed everything. And the variable E that came in that changed everything is what I call the new paradigm, because the paradigm has changed. That old system that created all that is gone. And actually, it started falling apart back here in 2005, which I guess I'll talk about separately in a minute. It started to become recognized. There was an anomaly. They got pushed off. It's an anomaly. Don't worry about it. The new paradigm comes from another place. I made some allusion to it last time, but let me get back there again. The less developed countries. The less developed countries of the world, and I'm talking about the non-developed world, let's say as of 1990, was virtually all the countries. The developed world was Europe, Western Europe mainly, not Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Japan, the United States. There were a few in between, like Canada, Australia, a few like that. Most of the rest of the country, the levels of income were so low you can't imagine anyone being able to support themselves. And basically, the reason the numbers got so low is they no longer had jobs where you could measure their income. They basically went back to agriculture and fishing, and which did not get recorded in GDP. These countries were called less developed countries. I think this semester I asked my students, did any of you ever hear of an LDC? No one did. That was 1990. This is 2009, so that was 19 years ago, so they were in diapers, so they never heard of an LDC. But I presume this crowd heard of an LDC. Or most of you, anyway. Less developed countries. What made these countries less developed? And these would be countries like Mexico, Latin America, very typically Southeast Asia, And it was the countries in the communist orbit, too. What made them? Well, the non-communist ones, anyway. Let me tell you the story of how they became less developed. Well, right after World War II, the United States State Department, in its infinite wisdom, decided that they had to have an economic development strategy for countries so that they had a strong economy and were not prone to go communist. And they hired a couple of guys out of Harvard, economic development guys, and they came up with an idea on how to do it, which is basically throw away Ricardo comparative advantage. And what these countries had to do is emulate and build little United States economies. Mimic the United States. Everything we produce, they had to have someone produce the same stuff. And hopefully, over time, they'll grow and be competitive against these United States producers, who in 1946, I mean, we clearly had the #1 economy, both in size and relative to everyone else. So they wanted to grow all economies to be lookalikes to the United States, but they had to start somewhere, and it was called, quote, the infant industry strategy. So basically, the only way that you can sustain the infant industry in competition with the developed world producing the same product is put up import duties to not let them in. So what they did is, to protect their infant industries, they put up duties, import duties, on any product they were going to produce in competition with the rest of the world, to force their people to only buy their own products and keep out the competition. And then that was one part of it. Now, what ended up happening is, when they put up the import duties, the United States retaliated. Because if you're going to keep our products out, we're going to keep your products out. So we ended up in a situation, because of this strategy, that every economy was cut off from each other as far as trade was concerned, because both sides wouldn't let other products in. So we had economic isolationism, in a sense, at least between us and the emerging market. Excuse me, the less developed countries. We later called them emerging markets. So in any event, they effectively stimulated the segmentation of economies from each other, and in an effort to build up their own automobile industry. Secondly, what they also did was, they reasoned that, look, if we're going to build an automobile industry in Mexico, we're going to need all the capital that we can get our hands on to build the factories. And we don't want our capital to go across the border and build factories in Detroit for General Motors. So we're going to put up capital outflow restrictions. So every one of these countries not only put up restrictions against U.S. goods going in, but they wouldn't let their capital go out. Now, the United States did not retaliate with capital outflow restrictions, but it was as if they did, because what effectively happens is that if we invest in a Mexican company, but you can't get the money out, there's no liquidity, no one's going to invest. So basically, by them shutting off capital outflow restriction, it cut off capital flows between countries. I'm not prescribing this as a wise development strategy. The wise development strategy came in 1989 by the President of Mexico, Carlos Salinas. Let me tell you what Carlos Salinas, he viewed the whole problem, and he figured out the solution. And it is a solution that turned all these LDCs into countries we now call emerging markets. The largest of which is China, and they're supplying us with lots of money because they've been so successful. Mexico was highly successful. All of them were. What Carlos Salinas did is he took a look at what happened as a result of the infant industry strategy. Capital left. They couldn't produce anything on the world market that would sell much anyway, and get through tariff barriers. And what he saw was that he said, look, we have a lot of labor. They're unemployed. Wages are very low. And what we need is some capital. We need some machinery. And if we could somehow figure out a way to attract foreign capital into Mexico to invest in Mexican companies, they can then buy plant and equipment, and then move the plant and equipment into Mexico, train the workers at very low wages, produce products that the developed world wants. I guess I would imagine this is produced in one of those countries. And basically, his idea of getting away from the industry nightmare was to figure out a way to attract foreign capital. And if you attract foreign capital, and then the other part is, if you can attract foreign capital, and then your companies then have the resources to buy plant and equipment, and you can start producing, but then you got to get rid of the tariff barriers. the tariff barriers that have been built in response to your own protectionism. So we went through something called Nafta, if you remember. Nafta was an across-the-board, year-by-year reduction in the barriers so that if they did get the capital, they could start producing and exporting.